Good late afternoon, everyone, early evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this very exciting session today on the power of civil society and government acting in partnership for transparency and anti-corruption. My name is Jennifer Lewis, and I serve as Senior Anti-Corruption Advisor in U.S.A.'s brand new Anti-Corruption Center, as well as our team lead for technical leadership and global programming. I also have the pleasure of serving as our agency's lead on the Open Government Partnership, where I've had an opportunity to partner with so many amazing reformers from around the world for the last number of years. In this role, I support part of our broader U.S. government efforts alongside the State Department to strengthen civil society and government partnership through the Open Government Partnership and our multi-stakeholder groups, and to boost concrete implementation of commitments made through the OGP platform through the National Action Plan process. I'm also pleased to serve with the State Department as part of our global engagement with OGP, including our brand new and renewed role on the OGP Steering Committee. I'm pleased today to be joined by an amazing panel of representatives and anti-corruption supporters from the governments of the United States, Ghana, and Spain, including Ambassador McDonald, who serves as the U.S. Ambassador to Lithuania, Mr. Steven Azantalo, who is the Director of the Anti-Corruption Department in the Committee on Human Rights and Administrative Justice in the Government of Ghana, and Mr. Lázaro Duñón, who serves as the Assistant Deputy Director for Open Government in the Ministry of Finance and Civil Service for the Government of Spain. I'm also thrilled to welcome our friend and colleague, Blair Glencorse, who serves as co-CEO of the Accountability Lab and the Civil Society co-chair of the Open Government Partnership, and Shreya Basu, who serves as Chief of Country and Local Programs at the OGP Support Unit. Today we will be discussing the essential role that OGP and its inherently locally driven platform can play in helping governments and civil society partner to both ensure openness, transparency, and accountability, and to advance anti-corruption goals globally. We know, of course, that OGP national and local action plans can be important vectors for anti-corruption reform. And today we will have a chance to hear from our panelists about the ways in which OGP has helped catalyze country-level action on key anti-corruption priorities. We also know that OGP's recently launched OpenGov Challenge presents us with a very concrete opportunity to raise ambition and catalyze action on these reforms. And so today we'll be also discussing how reformers across government and civil society can leverage the challenge to create lasting policy changes, both within the framework of the existing OGP action plan process and via new commitments and policies and programs in cutting-edge and critical areas such as public procurement, beneficial ownership, and political integrity. We have an exciting program for you this evening, and so without further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Ambassador McDonald to provide her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It is great to see a lot of familiar friends and faces. One might ask what the U.S. Ambassador to Lithuania is doing opening a panel on civil society and government on transparency and accountability. So full disclosure, before coming out to Lithuania, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the State Department, leading the office that engaged on Open Government Partnership. So that's why you have me in front of you tonight, and I am very grateful for your patience as I get to relive for 15 minutes my former position. But good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. You know, when we talk about the nexus between open and transparent governance and its role in the fight against corruption, we're also talking about how governments and civil society, which are really, this conversation is the hallmark of democracy, right? The fact that governments and civil society can come together to refine and to increase transparency and openness within governance. President Biden, U.S. President Biden, has made countering authoritarianism a hallmark, a key priority of his administration. He has called it one of the challenges of our generation. And we have seen clearly the interplay, not just in this region, but globally, between repressive governance and corruption. I think the plenary that was just held before this on triggers got into some of this discussion about how those countries that are seen as most corrupt are, in fact, also autocratic governments. And I think what we see, and what I like to say, is that corruption is the currency of repression. It is the means by which repression is fueled and executed to allow a system of cronyism, allow a system of centralized power to take root and to facilitate repression. Former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Brandeis used to say, and is famous for quoting, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I mention this because I think this is one of the founding principles of the Open Government Partnership. The idea that transparency and accountability in government is a disinfectant for corruption and corrupt practices. President Obama co-founded the OGP in 2011 alongside 7 other countries. We're very proud as the United States to see OGP's membership having grown to 75 national and 150 subnational governments, all working, of course, with literally thousands of civil society organizations and actors to bring accountability and transparency to governance worldwide. OGP, as many of you know, has a very unique model. It brings governments and civil societies together in the creation of national action plans, which spell out concrete commitments, the implementation of which OGP monitors and evaluates through independent and public evaluation. So the OGP mechanism is really meant to help guarantee that the country pledges or commitments are translated into some sort of concrete action, and the results of that are somehow measured. This, in turn, it's our belief, permits civil society to play a direct role in shaping and in overseeing governmental priority setting, governmental actions and policies, as well as accountability for the results of those policies. We have seen collectively since the beginning of OGP for about 4,000, just over 4,000 commitments that have been made globally to support transparency, accountability, and open governance. These commitments have advanced a wide range, of course, of reform actions and activities, but specifically related to anti-corruption, we've seen them engaged in beneficial ownership transparency, financial transparency and integrity, election finance reform, as well as new AML measures, anti-money laundering measures. I think also what we're seeing through the life of OGP's development is that principles of transparency and accountability are increasingly relevant to what we call kind of transnational corruption or strategic level corruption. And that is why it has become very much a primary goal of the U.S. term on the steering committee of OGP to elevate the salience of anti-corruption topics within OGP's work. It's also important, I think, to recognize OGP as a global community. It is not just governments. I mentioned the civil society aspect and the coming together of the two. Again, there are thousands of individuals and civil society organizations that are invested in this process and helping to hone and prompt more transparent and responsive governance to their people. OGP is also part of a broader constellation of multilateral anti-corruption institutions. And we have seen very much that the OGP action plans can often serve as a forum for keeping track of, for looking at the commitments that are made throughout that broad spectrum of multilateral institutions. So, for example, the IACCs, like you're at tonight, the UN Convention Against Corruption Conference of State Parties, the UNCAC COSP, the Summit for Democracy, S4D, et cetera. Domestically, let me just say one quick word about the United States and what we're doing, and then I'm going to turn it over to this illustrious panel because I think you will certainly learn more from them than from me. But domestically, let me just say that the U.S. has worked to live up to the OGP standards. In December 2022, we delivered the 5th National Action Plan. These are focused on 5 key themes on improving access to government data, increasing civic space, civil society engagement with the public, transforming government service delivery, countering corruption and ensuring government integrity, and finally, ensuring equal justice under the law. The U.S. has been working to ensure resource commitments against resourcing against those commitments, and then also to establish a regular reporting cycle back to the American public. And so I think at this stage, we feel that that is setting the stage for the 6th National Action Plan, which we will begin next year. So with that, thank you very much for letting me relive 10-15 minutes my former position. It's great to see you all here in Vilnius, and Jennifer, back to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador McDonald, those wonderful and inspiring remarks. We're now going to turn to some recorded remarks from Lázaro Tuñón, who unfortunately was not able to join us. Spain is an incoming co-chair for OGP, and we will now turn it over to his video.
Hello and good afternoon from Madrid. My name is Lázaro Tuñón. I'm the Deputy Director of Open Government here in Spain in the Ministry of Digitalization and Civil Service. And first of all, I must say I'm very sorry for not being with you in Vilnius these days. I would also like to thank you. Thanks to the OGP and also to the Department of State for counting on me to be part of this terrific panel. Just trying to answer your question very briefly, I would like to highlight the main efforts of the Spanish government in the national action plans to struggle against corruption. As you know, Spain was not one of the founding fathers of OGP, but we were one of the countries that started and that joined this initiative since its very foundation in 2011. In Spain, we have understood open government according to the recommendation of the OECD, so mainly as a culture of governance that promotes the principle of transparency, integrity, accountability, and stakeholder participation in support for democracy and inclusive growth. That is the case with Spain. That's what we have been trying to do during the 4 national action plans we had in the past and also now. So all these measures can be interpreted as some way of a preemptive means to avoid corruption. And that has been the case since the very first national action plan that we launched back in 2011. It seems ages ago, but it was really a cornerstone in the struggle against corruption. And I'm talking mainly on this first national action plan that went from 2012 to 2014, and that included a very important element, which is the law of transparency. This was the first universal for the whole government text, binding text we had that focused on the transparency, both the proactive disclosure of institutions, but also the right of citizens to access information. As the text sustains, only when the action of public officials is subject to scrutiny, when citizens can know how decisions that affect them are made, how public funds are managed, or under what criteria the institutions can, we can speak about the beginning of this public power answer to citizens' needs, and therefore a struggle, a fight against corruption. That law, which is in the very basis on the National Action Plan here and the open government culture in Spain, increased and reinforced the transparency in the public activity. It also helped to recognize and guarantee the access of citizens to information, and helped as a law establishing good governance obligation that public officials should comply with legal consequences derived from their no-compliance. We also had the Transparency Portal, which was also part of the national action plans we had in the past, and that was also a mean against corruption. This Transparency Portal that we still run, that serves for the whole administration here in Spain, it was very, very useful as it centralized the access to information that was made public about public procurement, subsidies, remunerations, everything concerning the expenses of the government was public all of a sudden. And this made a huge change in the culture of the public sector here in Spain. Not only that, in the third National Action Plan that ran from 2017 to 2019, we also had one element that was key against corruption. That was the Open Government Forum. That was a multi-stake forum that, if not at the beginning was designed as a means of anti-corruption, it helped us a lot integrating the decisions, the public decisions, by the stakeholders of open government. We have always thought that participation represented a major element in the fight against corruption. It helped us a lot, and somehow the words co-creation, the deliberative workshops, working together with civil society, were integrated in how we were doing things in the public sector. So corruption was no longer an option in the open government sphere, and this way of doing things in the open government way has been extended to other public policies. In the fourth National Action Plan that we are currently working on, we had major elements concerning integrity, concerning public integrity. We have a preventive public integrity system that is new, that helped us a lot for having a code of conduct concerning some elements that sometimes may create a doubt in public servants. That is the case, for example, with presence, with other elements that may be considered against a neutral diagnosis of reality and that may conduct to a conflict of interest. We also had a regulation of lobby registry. We had also in the fourth National Action Plan the modification of the law of incompatibilities of the personnel serving the public administrations, and all these elements have helped us a lot in this fight against corruption. This is not the end of the journey. We do have a lot of work ahead. That we are currently working new fifth National Action Plan that will also have an integrity and accountability element in it. It will help us a lot in this fight against corruption. We will model this fifth National Action Plan under the premises of the Open Government Challenge, and we will hope all these efforts in transparency, in integrity, in public participation would help us in this fight against corruption that I think we are delivering very, very well thanks to these national action plans. Just in a nutshell, just in conclusion, I would say that one of the best definitions we had of open government is the one we have in the prologue of the fourth National Action Plan, in which it insisted that open government is nothing else than the constant improvement of our democracies. And that's what we are trying to do with all these national action plans and what we would think as open government, in which corruption, in which the conflict of interest has no room. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this terrific panel. A big hug from Madrid. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Wonderful and inspiring words from our incoming co-chair, Spain, especially on open government as a way to improve our democracies. So that's a perfect way to kick off this panel. I'm going to introduce a round of questions to everyone, and then we will break out into individual questions. So for all of you, I'm hoping you might share with the audience and with all of us where we have found success using the OGP platform in really catalyzing open government obviously, but anti-corruption issues specifically, both domestically and internationally. So Stephen, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. And let me also thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be here. I wasn't initially billed to speak on this panel. I was made a last-minute substitute, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. In the sense that I have been in the fight against corruption for a very long time. And in the context of the Open Government Partnership, there's a need to understand where Ghana came from before we even got to OGP. Because our anti-corruption fighting effort has been, it has been, it has not been that very stable. We have had periods in which, after independence, the country has been subjected to several years of military rule. And anytime the military soldiers come to power, they have their way of fighting corruption. We have had situations in Ghana in which people were executed at firing squad because they were engaged in corruption. We have had situations in Ghana in which people were put into prison for long custodial sentences for reasons of the fact that they were engaged in corruption. People's properties were seized, were confiscated. A whole lot of things happened in the country. So fast forward, when we came to 1992, in 1992, we adopted a constitution. Now, two of the core principles of the 1992 constitution was that we said, look, we wanted to engage in probity, accountability, transparency, and participation. But these were mere words that were written in the constitution. How were Ghanaians going to achieve probity? How were Ghanaians going to achieve accountability? They were just written in the constitution. We have set up certain anti-corruption agencies in the country, and yet we are not reducing corruption. Indeed, studies by several, non-governmental agencies show that the problem of corruption remains very, very, problematic in Ghana. Indeed, in 2021, even when we had, implemented OGP, our anti-corruption efforts, was not that very good, because when we conducted a survey, it was realized that corruption was still endemic. Now, in 2021, Ghana decided to sign onto the OGP. After we signed onto the OGP, we have developed and implemented 4 national action plans. As we sit currently, we are in the process of implementing our 5th national action plan. Now, as if by God design, at the time that we were signing on to the OGP, we were also at that same time trying to develop a national anti-corruption action plan. And fortunately for us, the values and the principles of OGP assisted Ghana to develop, a coordinated and well-participated national action plan. In the sense that if you look at the principles, if you look at the activities, if you look at the strategies in our national anti-corruption action plan, it is built on the pillars of transparency, on the pillars of accountability, participatory, and then with the use of technology. Now, so Ghana has benefited so much from OGP, and by OGP, we have had a lot. We have implemented a lot of activities. We have ensured participation. We have engaged in policy reform. We have engaged in legal reform, and to the extent that if you come to Ghana, you come to realize that the problems of government is not as if government can have its say all the time. Civil society is present all the time, and government understands the work of civil society. Prior to OGP or prior to 2021, government used to perceive civil society as people who are noisemakers, are people who are there to disturb government. But after 2021, government has realized there is a need to sit down with civil society and co-create action plans so that together we can build the society. I can give you a lot of, policy reforms that we have engaged in, and I'll just give you about 2 of them. One of them has to do with the Right to Information Act. We have a constitution which guarantees the right to information. But that right to information was meaningless because people do not know how to access information. How do you access information from a public institution? If you write to a particular public institution and try to cite the constitutional principle, they will give you all manner of excuses. But under OGP, we commit ourselves that, look, we needed to have in place a Right to Information Act. And so in 2019, Ghana successfully passed the Right to Information Act. I will tell you that it wasn't easy passing the Right to Information Act because the process started in 1992, and NAP 1, it became part of our commitment, but politicians were not willing They were not excited about passing the right to information out for very good reasons. They knew that if you have such a law, it will expose them. But thanks to civil society, thanks to pressure from NGOs, we're able to have this law into place. The right to information allows Ghanaians to access information and also allow accountable institutions and governmental institutions to get information. And I'll tell you, as we sit, 2 years ago, there was one civil society organization that came under the Right to Information Act to, write to one of our governmental agencies, wanted to know from the audit service how many public servants have not declared their assets. Indeed, they got that information. They gave them a list of the public servants in Ghana who have not declared their assets, coming under the Right to Information Act. And based on that, they were able to bring a petition to the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice, which we are currently investigating. Apart from that is the whole issue of asset declaration. In Ghana, we don't have a good asset declaration regime at all. And it's not as if, I feel bad I'm saying this because we have a situation where public servants declare their assets, they only send the declare forms to the audit service. The forms are sealed and kept with the Auditor General. Nobody knows what the audit service has, what the particular public servants has declared. Under OGP, we have said that, look, the current law as it is not good for Ghanaians. There's a need for assets to be declared, to be verified. There's a need for assets when they are declared to be publicized so that Ghanaians can know what people have declared. And that's the commitment that we are trying to implement as we see today. There are a whole lot of things that the OGP has done for Ghana. One other thing has to do with power purchase agreements. In Ghana currently, we are going through a crisis of power. If you read Ghanaian literature, there's something we call doomsday in Ghana. Doomsday simply means a situation where you can have your electricity going off without being told why. And it's all because the type of power purchase agreements that we have with power companies are not transparent. So under OGP, we are trying to see how we can make these particular purchase power agreements transparent so that Ghanaians will know that this is what is happening. Because when we are able to do that, at least we're able to hold the electricity companies accountable. We're able to hold our Public Utility Regulatory Commission accountable and many other things. There are a lot of things that I can say, but I think I'll stop for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those comments and really driving home the point of how openness can really yield dividends, democracy dividends for citizens in very everyday ways, electricity bills and the like. Blair, I'm wondering if from your perspective, both as co-chair but also as Accountability Lab, how have you seen OGP be transformative in the anti-corruption space?
Thanks, Jen. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being here so late into the evening. I'm the co-chair of OGP this year. For those of you that don't know, OGP has a co-chair model, one person on civil society. That's me this year. I have the privilege on that side with a government. This year it's the government of Kenya. But the Accountability Lab, which is the organization I work for my day job, is heavily involved in OGP in a variety of different countries and different ways. And I thought I'd start briefly, Jen, by touching on generally why, from a civil society perspective, I think OGP is valuable. And the first point there, I think, is the framing. What OGP provides is a hopeful alternative, a different way of thinking about governance that is positive and that can build a different narrative around some of the changes of the kind that Stephen was talking about. I think in the governance space, we generally try to focus on the 90% of things that are going wrong and fill those gaps, rather than focusing on the 10% of things that are working and then expand that zone of governance and effectiveness outwards. And OGP, through the focus on commitments and plans, tends to drive forward that zone of governance. And in that way, it can shift narratives, it can shift norms, because that's such an important part of all of this. It's not just about policies and practices. Secondly, the OGP process is key. As we heard from the ambassador, it is very much a co-creation process between government and civil society, and really provides a mechanism to translate commitments made at the international level, but also at the national and local, into real action that can benefit citizens, which in the end is, of course, what all of this is about. And And then thirdly, that there are very concrete commitments. We heard how many. I think it's over 5,000 now in total, over 1,100 on anti-corruption specifically. And I thought I would touch on a few that relate to some of the priorities that myself and the government of Kenya have put forward this year within OGP that are in and around anti-corruption issues. So the first is inclusion, but youth in particular. We're building a youth collective within OGP, and talking to them last year, they talked a lot about how they want to be good trouble, not bad trouble. Young people want a way to channel their voices through systems and into policy making, and OGP provides that. And there's tons of examples of this happening from all around the world. In Chile, for example, through consultation with youth, the government developed a citizen participation manual for young people as part of their 4th National Action Plan. In Buenos Aires, at the city level, the city government provided training and education on sexual and reproductive rights through consultation with young people in the city about what they wanted. In Elgeyo Marakwet, which is a county in Kenya, the government there, again based on consultation with young people, has included a process to generate ideas from youth to feed into budgeting and policy making. So there's a lot of ways that this critical constituency, young people, can be brought into policy making, and we can harness their energies. The second is on civic space, very topical, of course. Again, a big priority for OGP. And again, tons of examples from around the world of how commitments on civic space have been integrated into action plans. Indonesia, for example, has conducted research to design roadmaps on restorative justice related to right to information issues, right to assembly and expression issues. In Nigeria, after the End SARS protests a few years ago, through OGP, the government co-created a guide for peaceful protests between the police and citizens and civil society and other independent bodies like the National Human Rights Commission. In Ukraine, through OGP, the government has now drafted a law on peaceful assembly with the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Interior and a variety of different civil society groups. So a lot happening there. And then finally on climate, which we've talked quite a lot about over the last few days, again, OGP provides the perfect mechanism, I think, to drive forward progress around some critical pieces of the climate accountability debate. So in Costa Rica, for example, the government has created an open data portal for climate data where it is shared and published publicly. In Germany, the government has put the infrastructure in place to disclose information on revenues from the extractive sector, which was part of their effort to become eligible for EITI. So there's then connections between OGP and a number of these other international efforts. And then finally, in Kenya, there's been a community engagement effort to solve climate issues, including around climate data transparency again, and ways to do that in conjunction with citizens. So all to say, there's tons of examples, lots to learn. There is an OGP handbook, and if any of you haven't come across the OGP handbook, I would recommend it highly. It's on the OGP website, and it has tons of these examples. It has sample commitments. It has all sorts of guidance and lessons across a whole variety of topics. It's a huge wealth of information, and that is a place I would start if you'd like to learn a bit more about all of these sorts of things through OGP. Let me leave it there.
Thanks so much, Blair, and some really great examples, including from our co-chair, Kenya, who could not be here today, so I love hearing those examples. Thanks a lot. So now I'll turn to Ivan. As a fellow donor, from a fellow donor perspective, perhaps, how do you see OGP spurring action on anti-corruption?
Thank you, Jennifer, for the floor. Thank you, dear colleagues, also for the invite. As Stephen, I was a last-minute addition to the panel, so happy to see you all here. A bit of introduction on myself. I'm Ivan Kandradzicki. I'm an advisor at the GIZ, the German Agency for International Cooperation. And not a classical donor, we are the implementing arm of the German government. So just to clarify that I'm not representing Germany here today, but representing the work we've done with OGP together on acting upon pledges on anti-corruption and transparency. So I'll try to be also brief and quite concise to tell you some interesting examples. Blair shared a commitment from Kenya from this year, and I would like to share a commitment from Kenya from 2016, where they said among the first, or one of the first countries in the world where they pledged that they would wish to establish beneficial ownership registries. So now in 2024, we have many examples around the world, but in 2016, this was quite a new topic. And it was a great signaling, I mean, there are the global anti-money laundering standards, so the AML-CFT standards that require countries to do these registers, but an OGP pledge is also to civil society and this co-creation process, to the general public, like signaling we're moving in the direction of transparency and developing these tools. So in essence, we took upon this pledge as the implementing agency through a program called Global Program Combating Illicit Financial Flows, where I worked for 4 years as an advisor, and together with a team, of course, from across the world. And taking upon this pledge, the government signaling their interest to develop this, we supported them specifically into the legal amendments and technical support and the whole roadmap from start to finish until in 2020, early 2020, Kenya was one of the first African jurisdictions to roll out a beneficial transparency register, which now is being updated, further developed, and is generating further pledges as well. So it was the initial signal of a very virtuous cycle that we've discovered and worked upon with OGP, because from this exchange, based upon the pledge and how it signaled commitment, we've used these pledges also to analyze and scope work in other countries that we've been active as GIZ. Another example where we also discovered a complementarity in our approaches, GIZ as implementing agency and OGP, was in North Macedonia, where there was also a process, again, beneficial ownership reform, happening 2019, 2020, from a legal side, technical side. But in this process, we also had a discussion with OGP colleagues where we by a chance encounter, we realized that the actors that we work with and the process we have, so the OGP, so the colleague with OGP would say more, but the ministerial access they have on a political level, on a leadership level, and on the other side, the operational access we have in multiple agencies, and also specific civil society dealing on anti-corruption, and also investigative journalism in some contexts. This is a very interesting mix that we decided to bring together. So specifically in North Macedonia, what we did with OGP is we did, and this was mid-pandemic, so everything was virtual, we did a series of peer exchanges between all of the actors that OGP works with and we work with on beneficial ownership. First bringing in the technicians and ministry sides for beneficial ownership, what it is, how is it unfolding. Then we brought in civil actors because this was a totally new topic for North Macedonia as well. We enriched it with experiences from other OGP countries like Serbia, like Croatia, like Slovakia in these peer exchanges. And it was really like this virtuous cycle showed itself again, how we complement each other, because it resulted in civil society especially being involved from the outset at the development of this beneficial ownership reform, because they interact with it in different settings. And just to illustrate some, so on the initial interaction, they're impacted by BOT reform. So we talked about before rolling out the register, how does it refer to them? What is a beneficial owner for civil society? How can they register? We don't want to cause an unintended consequence when they're excluded then from the financial system because not declaring a beneficial owner and so forth. So we could talk about impact even before the rollout, specifically for the country. And then building on this discussion, we came to a point where we used civil society in the context as a watchdog, so as a user of the beneficial ownership data. So we presented what they could access. We talked with the central registry, which then gave a pledge. So then in the upcoming action plan of North Macedonia, I think in 2020, they gave a pledge that they would open access to civil society for free. No fees, no obstacles. You request the information, you receive it directly. So we open doors ahead of time so they can utilize this data. And the third, after a series of exchanges, civil society is driver of new reform. So in discussions with the Central Register, our partners, we came upon also using examples like from Kenya and other pledges, we decided the government of North Macedonia, together with our technical assistants, decided to involve the beneficial ownership data in the public procurement process. So they put a pledge in their future action plan that is going to be, this tool will be realized, we're hoping in the coming months, that they will actually publish each beneficial owner who wins a public contract, so opening a new layer of transparency. So it's been a very, with the colleagues, Paul is here in the audience, and the colleagues from OGP, it's been a very, very fortuitous, interesting exchange over the past 3+ years, starting from also a difficult context mid-pandemic, but building upon, you know, the pledges themselves and commitment from the partners that they signal through these, and our commitment as an implementing agency for you know, developing measures for the partners. It's been a very enriching process. I think we've really multiplied our impact, and looking forward to do so in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And I love the idea of it magnifying sort of a culture and expectation of this engagement and openness and transparency that you articulated. So now over to you, Shreyas, to just give us a sense from the OGP perspective of your impact on anti-corruption.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I must say thank you for coming to me last, because I'm the only one whose day job is OGP. And so naturally, I would be biased. So I'm glad others before me talked about how they have used the platform, and I think there's nothing more heartening than to hear that from a donor perspective, from civil society, from the National Commission of Human Rights perspective, you're finding the platform effective. So I think the strongest endorsement perhaps coming from them, and we take that as user feedback, and that's heartening to hear. But I just want to touch upon a few things about what we've learned from the last 13 years of OGP. So we looked into all the commitments that were made at the 10-year mark, at our 10th anniversary. And we did find that anti-corruption commitments were most likely to be the most impactful commitments made in OGP, but also the ones that were likely to produce stronger results. So not just in the potential they held, but the results they achieved once implemented. And when you take that alongside the other data point, which is commitments tend to be much more ambitious, and produce stronger results when civil society is involved both in the planning and implementation stages. So, we've heard the term co-creation being used a couple of times. The power of that really shows in the results. It's not just collaboration for collaboration's sake. For us, what's been really interesting has been observing the way in which the platform has enabled broad-based coalitions to develop. On the one hand, to stretch ambition. So some of you spoke about Nigeria's commitment on beneficial ownership. Armenia is another country that has made great strides on beneficial ownership. And in both of these cases and a few others, initially the impetus for moving in this direction was from their commitments to the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative, where they had a roadmap by which they had to accomplish beneficial ownership transparency, particularly in the extractive sector. But what the OGP platform enabled was for those coalitions to be broadened beyond the extractive sector, for them to really use that as a jumping off point to get beneficial ownership, not just for the extractive sector, but more broadly. And in both of these countries came the time when it wasn't going to be enough for what executive action would enable, but you'd need Parliament to come along as well to pass enabling legislation. And so again, with the power of collective action from civil society, supported by development partners, but also the private sector becoming an ally in the process, in both of these cases, you did see enabling legislation being passed. And in a number of countries now, you're seeing parliaments become more formally involved in OGP, like in Kenya, where there's a parliamentary caucus now on open government. So that's been interesting to see how OGP has enabled the stretching of ambition through these broad-based coalitions. But also, I mean, to be honest, I don't want to make it sound like it's all nice and rosy everywhere in all OGP countries. We know we are operating in extremely difficult contexts. And there again, it's been interesting to see how these unusual coalitions have enabled progress in difficult circumstances. So a little backstory on one of the commitments that Blair mentioned on restorative justice for, when you have freedoms of association and information being attacked in Indonesia, the conversations around the co-creation table very much started around trying to change the civic space, the regulations around civil society. And simply put, the political will wasn't there to move on those issues at the time. And so because you had the justice actors as well as the civic space, the ones that were advocating for civic space changes, work together, they found this other entry point, which was this through the justice system. So in these difficult contexts, these unusual coalitions are enabling perhaps longer, but still useful entry points to tackle the same issue from a different perspective. And you see this also in the Philippines, for example, where recently, of course, they've made great strides on open contracting, but it cut to a few action plan cycles earlier, where the Commission on Audit, which had a very powerful citizen participatory audit program, expanded the program to include citizens in monitoring procurement contracts as well. Once again, not the first thing that you think of when you think of procurement reforms, but the way in which we are seeing oversight institutions, supreme audit institutions become involved in OGP, and really see this expand beyond the national executive has been interesting. Finally, I think what's also been helpful is to see how the peer pressure has helped galvanize others. So I think it was about 10 years ago when we first started seeing the first commitments being made around beneficial ownership transparency. We had a first handful, 2 or 3 countries come forward and try and tackle this extremely difficult reform. Today, there are more than 40 OGP members that are in various stages of implementing beneficial ownership transparency. So there is an ability to create this, a norm-setting opportunity that the platform offers by both trying to inspire a race to the top through healthy competition and pressure, but also in creating a very real platform where reformers can come together and share their lessons and, frankly, just find solidarity sometimes in the kinds of difficult reforms that they're often undertaking alone in very challenging contexts. And we've also found it very interesting the ways in which OGP is being used as a mechanism to implement international pledges being made at different fora. So for example, 10 out of 18 countries have used OGP to implement at least one commitment made at the Summit for Democracy, for example. And what we hope the independent reporting mechanism and the action plan process will enable through that is continued civil society involvement in implementation on the one hand, but also an independent accountability for results. So, when big pledges are made at global stages, then there is a follow-through mechanism that the OGP provides in the form of its independent reporting mechanism. So these are the ways in which we've seen it being effective. Of course, success stories are still too few and far between, and we hope that those in this room and beyond will continue to leverage the platform to continue to make strides.
Thank you so much, Shreya, for that great overview of some of the successes. And really, it is heartening in an anti-corruption conference where it's easy to get kind of depressed by the end of the week to think about where forward progress is and the note about ambition. So that actually is a great segue to the Open Gov Challenge, which has just been posed, of course, by the steering committee, by OGP itself last September at the Global Summit. And so many governments are seeking to rise to this challenge. Blair, I'm wondering if I can turn to you, just from your perspective, what do you think the unique role is for civil society in terms of spurring action on this challenge?
Thanks, Jen. Yes, so the challenge is a mechanism through which governments can work with civil society in OGP countries to put forward ambitious commitments around a whole variety of different topics. And as we heard, when governments work with civil society in this way, it makes the implementation of commitments more ambitious, more effective, and it drives implementation forwards. So it's an opportunity for civil society to further push on many of the kinds of things that we've been hearing about, but also in a way that can fit the opportunities that may exist. These are commitments that could be made perhaps as part of the development of a new plan through OGP, but also not within the plan cycle, so individual commitments by governments where there might be opportunities to work on these issues. And I think it's a way for civil society to begin to coordinate around OGP. One of my best memories of OGP was in 2017, Sanjay Pradhan, who we heard from in the opening plenary, came to Liberia, was full of energy, was talking a lot about these issues. I was there with our team in Liberia, and many of the civil society groups were quite frustrated at that point with the progress that was being made. And after a whole series of meetings, one of them came to me at the end of the week and said, I understand now why OGP is so important. It's not just about the commitments, it's about the way that it helps us coordinate ourselves and build collective energy to push forwards, which is what Liberian civil society has done through OGP ever since. They passed a beneficial ownership law through OGP. The Anti-Corruption Commission there now has prosecutorial powers, which is something they were also really pushing for. So there's been a whole series of changes. But to come to the challenge specifically, I think one key benefit of this, and Shreya might say more about it, is it's an opportunity to build ownership of OGP reforms across a broader array of government agencies. It's a way to raise ambition, and we're already seeing, from a civil society perspective, some really interesting commitments being made by governments in partnership with civil society through the challenge. For example, in Brazil, there are big plans for large infrastructure projects, which of course are potentially quite risky from a corruption perspective. So TI Brazil and a number of other organizations have worked with the government for a commitment around the transparency and public participation in infrastructure spending. In Ukraine recently, the government developed a whole-of-government anti-corruption strategy across 15 priority areas with civil society as part of the challenge. So that's moving even in quite a difficult context. And I think there's a number of incentives for civil society to engage in these challenge commitments. So those of you who are here from civil society, I would encourage you to do so. One is of course the opportunity to just fast track these kinds of progress on these kinds of issues. The second is a lot of visibility and credibility. As I mentioned earlier, OGP is very good at storytelling and putting these commitments and the progress and the people involved out there in ways that can build credibility and advocacy. Third is, as Shreya mentioned, there's a huge peer learning network within OGP, not just on the government side, but on the civil society side. There's a lot to be shared, a lot of community to be built, and the challenge, again, can provide an opportunity to do that, including through cohorts and peer groups of different kinds. And finally, recognition. I think there's an idea to link the challenge to awards, to spotlight efforts of different kinds, to events. So all of this is to say that it's a fantastic opportunity, I think, to further drive forward progress on all of these issues. And on the civil society side, if we on the steering committee can be of any help to support civil society to be engaged, just please let us know.
Thanks very much, Blair. I love the idea of it being an inadvertent catalyst for an open gov community and a strengthening of civil society just by virtue of engagement with governments. And so you heard the challenge there. So I'm going to turn to you again, Shreya. So from a perspective of OGP, why should OGP members respond to this challenge? What's different about it?
So I think in those countries where there is momentum for reform, the challenge doesn't just accept any and everything under the 10 themes that the challenge covers. We are being a little bit more bold in asking for ambitious reforms on those 10 challenge areas. And that was a response to what we heard from our community when we were trying to put together our strategy for 23-28 period. So for those settings where there is a domestic momentum for these reforms, the challenge offers an opportunity to bring others along, to inspire others. But of course, with that comes also the peer support, the spotlighting, the recognition that Blair mentioned. So in a way, what has happened with beneficial ownership, 2-40, open contracting, perhaps similar kind of growth, we hope that gets replicated in other areas, and governments that are early adopters will be able to take others along with civil society counterparts. In contexts where that momentum does not exist, the challenge offers an important advocacy tool, the ability to be able to point to others who are taking up the challenge and call out in action. But also a pathway. Blair mentioned briefly the OpenGov Guide, which has plenty of specific recommendations. We hope to be able to expand that to include benchmarking as well, so countries can self-assess where they are on a particular issue and how they can make progress from from their vantage point. So in those contexts where you don't have that momentum, we hope it's a powerful advocacy tool in the hands of reformers, both within government and, of course, in the hands of civil society, and that through, again, the peer exchange moments like these, the OGP summits and regional meetings, the challenge will offer a pathway for the skeptics to become convinced over time as well.
Thank you so much, Shreya. And so let's talk a little bit about that ambition. We heard directly from OGP about why governments should engage, but I'm wondering, Ivan, if maybe you could reflect a little bit on how you think OGP members could respond to this call for action, and particularly where the opportunity may be to kind of reboot existing or new commitments.
Of course, that's a very interesting question, and I would like to bring the attention, perhaps, or urge to see more pledges in the OGP challenge for a certain topic, and that's on the protection of civic space, that I know is one of the 10 core areas where you expect challenges. Governments to send in pledges for challenges that can be more ambitious. So as the beneficial ownership topic came through. And multiple OGP members, so spread like a positive virus, I would say, like with multiple pledges and then reform, like we talked about. The shrinking civic space element and multiple reports show that civic space is on the decline around the world. So globally, it's regressing in all countries, including, of course, the OGP members. So one specific area where we could see more ambitious pledges is by governments to pledge that they will ensure that civic space has unrestricted access to the financial markets and their bank accounts, and they can do their work in an unhindered manner, because through our work in the past 4 years, we've discovered that one of the main mechanisms how civic space shrinks is that they're considered often to be a high-risk entity in the financial system. This is sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally in the application of these standards. And this is detrimental because any civic society organization in the audience here or at this conference could say to you, without funds, they're unable to do any of their good work in countries. So as the global standards inspired governments to put pledges to be transparent on beneficial ownership, the same standards reflect a need for civic society to work unhindered in this space. And I'm talking about the global AML CFT standards, again, from the FATF, not to bore you with technicalities, but these same standards we wish they will inspire governments to be ambitious and say we will work, and there's many mechanisms that we've implemented as an agency, and again, North Macedonia and Albania and Peru, also in Tunisia, where we do collaborative analysis together with government and civil society on where this exclusion happens, how it happens, doing roundtables with stakeholders from the financial sector. But it takes a bit of courage, it takes a bit of openness and transparency, and also both sides to step forward. So not to take any more of the time, but I would really, we would really, as GIZ, wish to see more of this, because it definitely, with shrinking civic space, that's the core at OGP, as I've understand the initiative in the past years. It's at the core of co-creating these plans. So we need to ensure that civil society organizations thrive and expand instead of being on the retreat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivan. So Stephen, I'm going to turn to you for one question for you, and then we'll move into one final round robin and then some Q&A from the audience. So how, from your perspective, how can we use OGP to raise ambition and drive more meaningful implementation for citizens?
Thank you very much. One of the biggest challenges to the implementation or effectuation of commitments in our part of the world has always been the lack of political will. And the lack of political will doesn't just manifest itself only in politicians, even in state institutions, heads of state institutions. You see, there's one thing making a commitment, and another thing committing yourself to devoting resources, both human and material, to ensure that that commitment is effectuated. That is where we are. And I'll give you a perfect example. Under one of our national action plans, we had, committed ourselves to developing a citizen complaint center. Now, the idea of having a citizen complaint center is just to allow the public who are seeking service for public institutions to ensure that when they're accessing service and they're not getting service, they should be able to have a medium, a mode to complain, so that once that complaint is made, at least somebody can address it. That is a commitment that we made under NAP 3, NAP 4. We have repeated it under NAP 5. Why is it not working? It is not working because the information ministry, which was supposed to ensure the implementation of this idea, it was not forthcoming. You go, you ask questions, and you don't know where we are. Another thing that we need to also look at is the issue of trust. How do we build trust? Trust is a problem because when civil society and government institutions meet, sometimes it depends on who is coming to the table. If you don't have somebody who is coming to the table with a good idea, and let me tell you one thing. There are some persons who are in civil society, they are out of government. They are able to, when they are out of government, you see them high-spirited, they are doing all sorts of things. But a government comes to the power, and such a person finds himself being appointed in that government. So you ask yourself, at the time that you were ensuring that, or you were trying to, ensure that government commits itself, or this particular government commits itself to this project or idea, and at that time that you were putting so much pressure, and you were criticizing government, did it mean that you had an ulterior motive? So normally, the issue of trust arises, and I think that this is something that, as a community of OGP, we need to be able to surmount. But coming to the ambitious projects that we have, I think that they are very good projects. We need to do with them. But all the same, we need to look at our resources. Do we have the resources to implement those commitments? If we don't have the resources to implement those commitments, there's no point putting up a commitment when we cannot implement. This is what I want to add. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. I actually appreciate that you brought up some really concrete challenges. It's all well and good to write things on paper, and there are some real constraints, both resource and also in terms of trust, which is so important. So we just have time for a very brief final remark from each of you. So if you could please keep it to 1 to 2 minutes maximum, and that's really where you see the next frontier for open government. So Stephen, I'll start with you, and we'll go right down the line, and then we'll open it up to Q&A.
Well, thank you very much. I earlier indicated that we have developed a NAP 5, and we are in the process of implementation. Now, under NAP 5, you come to realize that we have had to repeat some of the commitments that we made under NAP 4, i.e., take for instance the issue of asset declaration. I always indicated that under the issue of asset declaration, you see, Chapter 24 of our 1992 Constitution provides for a code of conduct for public officers. Now, there are certain provisions under that chapter. One, avoidance of conflict of interest. All public officers are supposed to declare their assets before they take office, after every 4 years, and before they leave office. And of course, there's also another provision that has to deal with the oath, respecting the oath of office that you have taken. Now, I have the humble view that if we are able to, people have to take OGP very serious, we should be able to effectuate in Ghana, for instance, we should be able to ensure that we pass the conduct of public officers bill into law. Because why? This is the law that when it comes into place, it will go a long way to solve the issues of corruption. Corruption remains a pernicious challenge to Ghana. And for us, until and unless we are able to verify the access of public officers, we'll be deceiving ourselves. Until we are able to have access to information on what public officers are doing, we should be deceiving ourselves. So I think that we should be able to, as the next frontier for OGP, we should see how we can fight the frontier of transparency. We should be able to see how we can ensure that good governance is brought to the doors of the people. And we should be able to see how we can involve people at the grassroots in the OGP process. I tell you, at some point in time in Ghana, people look at the OGP concept as an elitist concept. Why? Because they were not part, they used to hear OGP, but it was only limited to civil society and governmental actors. I am of the humble view that we need to begin to involve other actors outside the civic space. So take for instance, traditional religious leaders, faith-based organizations, so that all together we can move forward to build a better society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that point on diversification of voices. That's really important. Blair?
Thanks, Jen. In terms of themes, frontier themes, there are obvious ones that we've been talking about, AI. One that I haven't heard much about this week, but I think is really interesting, is is cryptocurrencies and the tokenization, the stuff that, for example, the Central African Republic is doing around natural resource management and land. El Salvador, of course, we've heard about. Not necessarily OGP countries, but I think we're going to see more and more of that sort of stuff. But actually, in terms of frontiers, I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that that Stephen said in his previous intervention. One is political will. We have to build political will for this agenda. There are still far too few governments taking this seriously enough. Our institutions are not fit for purpose in many cases to create the collaboration that's needed to solve many of these issues transnationally. And we just have so many polycrises to fight at the moment that we're not collectively being strategic about some of these things. So we need to build political will. That's part of what we are trying to do now as co-chairs of OGP with the government of Kenya. And we have some news coming up on that soon that I think we'll tell you all about. The second is funding. I was chatting with Michael Jarvis from a place called the TAI Collaborative, which is a donor collaborative about funding in this space recently. And they were looking at some of the numbers. And between 2018 and 2021, only 0.09% of philanthropic funding and 0.012% of ODA flows went to governance and anti-corruption issues. It's a fraction of what is already an insufficient amount. Unless we can drive more funding into this space to support the kind of initiatives that we're talking about, we're never going to get anywhere. The US government, by the way, is one of the few governments that's really meaningfully funding this work currently, and so thank you for that. And we need to keep pushing. And then finally, we need to popularize this agenda. So much of what we've been talking about the last few days is highly technical, and it's us talking to each other. We need to build more unlikely networks, as we call them at the Accountability Lab, build narratives that explain why all of this is important to citizens and how it affects their lives. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to bring in sufficient energy to solve these problems.
Thanks a lot, Blair. Thanks for mentioning the resourcing issue. I'll just take the opportunity and prerogative to mention that this is exactly why U.S.A. launched the Integrity for Development campaign as part of the Summit for Democracy process, which is aimed at galvanizing increased resources in light of this diminishing anti-corruption envelope. I'll also note that we're joined in that effort by Norway and Sweden, who have been very steadfast partners for us. Ivan?
Thank you. I'm going to be maybe a bit controversial, the next frontier on open government. From the perspective where we cooperate now with OGP in my current role, I think the next frontier will be really defending democracies together around the world, because also multiple reports show that it's regressing on multiple sides. And currently, I recently started a role at a Team Europe Democracy Secretariat, where the colleagues from OGP are sitting with me in a working group on anti-corruption accountability. One of the goals of this network is to bring in civil society voices, member states of the European Union, EU Commission, all together joining forces to strengthen the portfolio to defend democracy globally through, as Blair said, anti-corruption accountability is essential to this. So our next frontier together with the OGP team is to take best practices that, because not only pledges, I believe OGP has a lot of knowledge as well, together with other actors. So they accumulate a lot of best practices, and also on another side, the practices of involving CSOs more closely in anti-corruption work and accountability work. So to bring these principles and best practices through this network to different fora in partner countries around the world to help them defend. I know it sounds like a very ambitious goal, but we're really committed to it in the coming years to invest our energy and resources into. So it's, again, essential to open government, right? The essence of a democratic governance. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, Shreya, over to you. Final word.
So specifically in the context of anti-corruption, since we are here at the ISCC, for us, I think the next frontiers would include going after the root causes, for which for long have been the untouchables, and still are to some extent in OGP today. So we really need to talk about political party financing, truth in political advertising. We need to talk about the enablers and how we regulate enablers. Lobbying transparency, and we are seeing some countries step up. Canada has made a commitment on truth in political advertising. We have a number of countries working on lobby transparency. So these untouchables now need to be the next frontier that we touch. Having said that, I must add that a slight worry is if we think about the next frontiers and move on to the next issues. And certainly now is not the time to take the foot off the pedal on the important progress we've made on areas like open contracting, on beneficial ownership, because the job is certainly not done. And to sort of pick on what Ivan, you said earlier, to go back to the fundamentals, because none of this is going to be possible without civic space, without basic access to information guaranteed. So even as we look to the next frontiers, I think useful for us to remember that we can't take the fundamentals for granted.
Thank you so much, Shreya. That's a perfect way to end. Not taking our foot off the pedal, so while driving full forward at full speed to save democracy. No big, small challenge there. Okay, let's open it up to the floor. Q&A, we have about 12 minutes, actually more like 10 minutes, sorry. I will say that I have trouble seeing the audience because of these lights, so perhaps we can... And I'm sorry, if you could please state your name, your affiliation, and please keep your question to 1 minute or less.
Hi, Stephen Brager with USAID in Guatemala. I guess my question is, I'm familiar with OGP and the work you all done that's been done with it. My understanding is that it is largely an executive branch initiative. And so my question really is, what about the legislative branch? And to what are there models of engagement that involve the legislative branch, given its representational role, its obviously legislation role, its oversight role, and so, what models have you observed over? I mean, sorry, too used to the Zoom.
Yeah, too many Zoom meetings. Thanks, Stephen. Let's take one other question. I can't. Oh, right over here. I think I see someone.
Thank you. I'm Danella Newman from the UNCAC Coalition. So I would like to echo Ivan's call for more open gov challenge pledges on civic space, not just at the national, but also the international level. So at the moment, in the framework of the UN Convention of Corruption Against Corruption's implementation review mechanism, civil society participation is not mandatory, and states are starting to discuss what the modalities for the next phase, follow-up phase of this IRM should look like. So I would like to also ask the panelists, but Ivan especially, how can we ensure that governments make such pledges to expand civic space and ensure it is there and civil society organizations can participate also at the international level, and that they then also make those pledges not just in the OGP fora, but also the UNCAC fora in Vienna.
Thanks for that great question. Let's take one more over here. Sorry to make you cross the room all the way over here.
Hi, my name is Matt Aubrey. I'm from the executive director of the Organization for Responsible Governance in the Bahamas. We're OGP wannabes. We've been in queue. As a civil society organization, we've been advocating to various administrations about the value of OGP, and I understand the strategy of taking it at the top. But to build on Stephen's point, we're thinking now, how do we build value from the public will to drive for that? Because I don't see our administrations being pulled necessarily by wanting to belong to this group as much as if it was a priority for folks in the street and they understood what that meant, that could be critical. So any thoughts on that would be or initiatives that were in that vein would be great.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to give the first question to Shreya to talk a little bit about maybe some of the open parliaments work.
Sure. So actually, parliaments have played a crucial role in OGP from its early days. So while it's true that it's the national executive that signs on to membership, I don't have the exact numbers at hand with me right now, but at least over a third of countries have parliamentary engagement in OGP. And this happens through a variety of modalities, some institutionally part of the multi-stakeholder forum in the country, others with a little bit more of an arm's distance where civil society and officials collaborate, but they try to keep the actual mechanisms a bit more informal in the fear of breaching upon constitutional separation of powers. One thing I will say is we hear this argument a lot. And while there have been constitutional crises triggered in a number of countries, I can guarantee you that's not been because Parliament engaged in OGP processes, at least not to date. Specifically, the ways in which they can engage, of course, is to take on legislative commitments as part of the action plan. Well, we have also created methods for parliaments to be able to submit and co-create convene their own processes for co-creation, submit standalone plans. We are very pleased that under the direction of the new strategy, we are able to offer that also for the judicial branch, for oversight institutions, not necessarily as a mechanism because more for more is better, but because we recognize that there might be certain contexts where one branch of government remains more conducive for meaningful reform while the door shuts on another. So starting this year, we are piloting not just standalone plans from the parliament, but also from judiciary and autonomous institutions. And of course, local governments now in their own right can join the OGP local program, but also there are a number of countries where we are seeing localization efforts at the national level as well.
Thanks a lot, Shreya. Ivan, would you like to?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for the question. I'm no expert of the UNCAC coalition, and I don't know how useful this will be for you, but I think ensuring that this happens is never, there's no guarantee, but I can give you an example how we've seen the commitment on a national level transferred to the international level of involvement of civil society is that through this national engagement on some of the work we've done that, not to go into too much detail, the work we've done on this financial inclusion for civil society related to these global standards is that through the national initial roundtables, there was a lot of effort needed for the trust to be established between government and civic space. There was an initial distrust in the status quo. So after building on a national initiative and doing the national reform, the civil society organizations felt courageous to speak more closely with the authorities and also gain confidence to gather some of those practices and examples that then they applied in together with government in the international fora on the global AML CFT standards, and then they were recognized as global best practices for inclusive approach. So we saw that that's probably the only way that you could go about this, is that you start on a local level, on a national level, building on certain items and then bringing them forward to the international fora, because that's also how civil society can also coagulate and advocate for inclusion globally by showing the good examples on a national sense.
Great, thanks. Bear, maybe you can very quickly take that last question on civil society.
Yes. And just briefly on the civic space question, I think the Dominican Republic, if I'm not wrong, Shreya, has put in a really interesting challenge commitment on this topic, which doesn't only try to open up or prevent the closure of civic space, but to actually actively open it up. So the details are on the challenge website and might be worth looking at. And again, that's one of the values of OGP. There's lessons all over the place that can be adapted. On the question about sort of how to get the public interested in OGP, we haven't talked much about OGP Local, but there is a big OGP Local program for local governments, over 150 now. That might be a more interesting or possible entry point in places where there might not be political will at the national level. The rules for OGP have recently changed, so local governments can join from countries that in which the national government has not joined OGP. But beyond that, I think we need to get creative. I talked a little bit about kind of narratives and engaging different kinds of people. There's lots more to do on that front, thinking of creative ways to engage different sorts of populations that can then harness their energy to drive forward efforts within OGP. And finally, I think OGP is not precious about open government. I think OGP really wants to ensure that open governance is happening, that these policies are being put in place and these actions are being taken, even if they're not within national action plans. So, there's a lot that can be done on this topic, of course, even if technically the Bahamas is not part of OGP. One quick example on that. For example, in Liberia, we've been working with a lot of musicians. They put out some music recently around the need for a war and economic crimes court, which, as some of you may know, has now been established. Huge win for accountability and justice issues. And that music, those songs, created some of the engagement and brought in some of the kinds of people that were needed to push that over the finish line. So things like that, I think, are effective.
Thanks so much, Blair. We have time for one super fast question. We've got 5 minutes, so I can take one more question for the panelists. Otherwise, we can also move to closing. Any final questions? Okay, I think I see someone up here in front. Oh, there's two. I'm sorry, I didn't see who went up first. I can't see from here. Apologies.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm quite new to the anti-corruption space, and as a Polish national living in Vilnius, I've been, listening a lot about OGP, Accountability Lab, learning a lot. But my question is, what's up with Poland? Why, what's the problem there? It makes me feel some type of way that I don't see Poland on the list of countries involved.
Well, we're in very active efforts to try and get the Polish government to join OGP, aided also by Polish civil society efforts. So we hope the day is soon.
Great. I think we have time for that last question back there. If you could be very brief in your question.
Yes.
That's great.
The question, I'm Pablo Herrera, I'm from Mexico, and from DLM, we work demanding accountability with a human rights perspective. We have been working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of the Public Function. However, in Latin American context and like the actual Mexican context, we're living critical moments right now. So you have misinformation and hate speeches from the executive daily, disclosing sensitive information from civil society, and spyware abuse for us. So it will be like, how can we counteract this fake speeches in committing these partnerships within government and civil society organization, and be able to earn more spaces and be more fruitful on our work, if it's like international cooperation, or support. So it would be like this insights that I would like to hear from you.
Great. Who would like to take that? Does anyone?
I'm happy to give it a shot. So one of the 10 challenge areas is on digital governance, and tackling mis and disinformation is part of that challenge. Of course, now in settings where that is being actively used as a tool by incumbent governments, it's unlikely that you're going to get a commitment from the same government. But this is where we are hoping that us making it more flexible for civil society to work with other branches of government, autonomous institutions, to try and safeguard the space till the conditions evolve to hopefully better conditions. That's one of the things that we are trying. There's also a lot of opportunity for peer learning and exchange. A number of civil society organizations going through the same, unfortunately, the same attacks. So we are hoping that the OGP platform can also be one where, especially in those contexts where we can pick up early warning signs and learn from the experiences of Mexico and others on what can be done proactively to prevent situations from being deteriorated further. And there are a number of great groups like, Access Now and others that do provide some degree of support for civil society on how they might be able to protect themselves from surveillance and other digital threats. So happy to connect actors to those experts.
Thanks so much, Shreya. Well, so I think we've heard today about both the power of OGP as a platform in bringing together civil society and government to act together on transparency and anti-corruption. We also heard a little bit about how it can also catalyze and galvanize civil society to organize itself, to come together on specific actions. We heard about very real-life challenges with implementation of OGP and some of the challenges in terms of sustaining momentum on political will and follow-through. We also heard about the promise of ambition, both through the Open Government Challenge, which is what OGP is using to really reboot this partnership. And you heard finally the need to have pedal to the metal, as we say in English, to get all the way, not just in terms of implementing our existing commitments, but really to push into that new frontier, especially in light of rising threats to democracy. So I think that's a great way to end this panel. I'd like to thank the panelists for joining me. Thank you also to our online panelist who was not able to join us, and to Ambassador McDonald, who had to leave early, and thanks most importantly to you as an audience for joining us here today. Thanks.